Hello, everyone. Welcome to class tonight. Welcome to our second live face-to-face. Week 3, ask you to turn your cameras on. Helps it makes it a little more enjoyable for everyone involved. And look at that, my Zoom works. Hey, it's a good thing. I had to have it updated, and computers are not always my thing. So, welcome to what we got going on. I'm going to share just so that way we can start. Just talk a little bit about what we have for tonight and what we have coming up. So let's do that. Let me kind of put a couple things around really quick. I'm sharing this one here. Awesome. All right. So today we're talking about scores, meaning to scores. I find this very interesting. I'll try to make it a little more interesting for you, but I think it's kind of a good way to do it. Talk a little bit about that as we're going on. If you look at the assignments, we have a discussion post process that's due today, so that will finish up today. And then this week we don't have anything going on, but you'll want to start kind of thinking forward. We'll talk for just a minute about this idea around there's a couple things coming up. The assessment instrument evaluation, which is coming, it's not due until October. We'll talk about that in the next couple of weeks as we get closer. And then also the one thing that I do want to talk just a minute about, which is going to be a lot more later in the class, but I want you to think about it, is we're going to be asked to do something. We're going to be asked to compose a program evaluation. And that's what this final project is. And so here's kind of an example of, I'll download it because it makes it a little bit easier for you guys to see. It looks like this. And a program evaluation is I encourage you, this is the time that you go look up either in this is a chat GPT type of thing that you can take a look at. It's a way for you to kind of think through what it is. You'll read some of the materials, we'll get into it. But a program evaluation is simply some way that you would go through and evaluate a program. So this thing here, you'll see a lot of it. There's going to be a lot of elements that I want you to do. You're not doing the program evaluation. You put it together so that you have the information to do it if you had wanted to. So we'll talk about all these things. How do you put together program outcomes? We'll talk about some of the kind of what you're looking at, what your objectives may be, who your participants are, who the stakeholders, all this kind of stuff. So this is an example that's in there. This is obviously, usually as professors, we put in the one that's over the top as the example. So, just at least kind of a direction to be able to do that. But what's important, the reason I wanted to highlight this for you is that these are the kind of the elements. You'll see it as we go in. I'll put that out there. These will be the elements that we'll talk about. Don't stress about them yet. It's not due until the end of the class. This is a December thing. But what I want you to start thinking about is what is going to be the program that you are interested in doing this final project or writing about for your program evaluation. So during in October, you're going to put together what we call a program identification. And this just basically tells me what the program is, who are the stakeholders, just really quickly for you to kind of go through and begin to thinking about what you're going to do. But you should have a pretty good idea what you're interested in. So let me give you an example for a second. So if I were to do program evaluation can be any type of program. And I use the word program. It could be an initiative, could be an intervention, could be anything that's kind of going on in your school that you or your site or your potential site or something that you would imagine. You don't have to be at a site. It would what you may want to do in the future, maybe something you saw when you were in school, anything along those lines. It could be an intervention. One of the things that we have going on right now, and I'm actually going to be participating in a conversation with some folks here in a couple of weeks around high dosage tutoring. Maybe there's something that's going at a school district right now that they've decided to purchase high dosage tutoring. Well, how do you know that it works? That's what a program evaluation would do. It goes through and it identifies kind of what are the objectives and how do you do it? Who's supposed to participate? Who are those? Any of that kind of stuff. Another one might be you have an after-school program that's really putting together some I don't know, maybe you're spending a lot of money in your after-school programs on things like boxing or homework help or whatever. Is it working? Is there something that's happening with it? What is it? What's good? So this would be something that you would put this would be a program that you could do. Maybe you're initiating a new instructional approach in the classroom that you're working in. And so you're going to talk about, you're interested in knowing, does this work? What is going to happen? So there's an overlay of research, which research and program evaluation we'll get to later on to talk about the difference. Research really is this idea of just kind of doing some of the research and doing it more for the research purpose. A program evaluation truly is kind of something that you're expecting to get something out of it, to be able to use and change what you're doing. So I just want you to be thinking about what types of programs that may be of interest to you. Does not have to be classroom based, does not have to be educational based. If you're kind of working in a different space, maybe you've been working in a treatment center, they want to try a new treatment approach, or they want to introduce, I mean, you can have anything from going through and we want to try a new schedule for the students who are actually participating in this, and is this going to work? Putting it all together, what does the research say? What are your objectives? How are you going to measure it? What are the outcomes that you expect? All those kinds of things. So a program evaluation, which we'll get to, don't worry, is just one of those elements. And so I want you to be curious now over the next few weeks. Just start looking around your own environments and be thinking, what does this look like? Literally, this might be something that you go in and do a little bit of chat GPT, and that's a great resource for that, to be able to have them pull up some ideas on what are some programs evaluations around this particular area that you're interested in, or this particular area. And then you can start to think about what that would look like. You're not going to be, that's a great place to start, because you're going to be doing your own. You'll be able to kind of figure out what is the purpose, what's the type of program, who are the stakeholders. This would be something that's around you that you may actually have access to. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. We'll talk about this again, but I want you to start thinking about it now. What questions as of now do you have about that? What questions as of now? Unmute if you have them, please do. And there will be lots, so it's okay if you don't have anything yet and you just need to dig in a little bit. We'll start each week with just a little bit kind of a review and that kind of stuff. Any questions about what we talked about?
Is it just research, like we look online for these things, like articles, or would we have to get in contact with like people that run the program?
It could be a mix. It depends upon how much access you have to it. I'd prefer for it to be more you doing things that you have access to, so it's more realistic. Some of you don't have some of those tools or things available to you, but it doesn't have to be school-based. So let's say you're doing something, I mean, come on, we do programs in our house. We may do something at church. We may be doing something else like that. You could do those as well. I'm totally fine with that. And a program is a term that's very squishy. So there's a lot you can do. So I would prefer that it is something you'd have access to, so you could answer some of these questions. But as we get closer, we'll talk about it. We'll set up some times to talk about this too. What other questions?
Well, hello, I'm Aline. I'm actually here for the first time. I'm kind of landing into the course right now for other reasons, but I will send you an email about it.
Great.
Unfortunately, I was not on the first day, but I watched the recording last week, and I'm kind of little by little landing. Nice to meet you, Malini. I was just thinking about it right now. This is my last credit to finish my master's in curriculum instruction.
Great.
So I already submitted my final project and everything. And I was supposed to take this class in the summer, but they closed it. There was not enough students enrolled, so I actually ended up having to do it now in the fall. But
we're happy to have you with us. Sorry you didn't get to take it.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's okay. But I happen to have graduated with a very talented young lady called Peng from Thailand. She is an international student. She plays tennis at Fresno State. And we are right now working on a nonprofit called Equity for All. And one day I am happy to share a little more about what it is if I have the opportunity. But one of the programs that we're just creating is educational field trips, which is something that I already did in Brazil. I'm from Brazil. So I already did in Brazil. So I am thinking about using that also to evaluate my own program, if that's the case.
And that's what this is about. You're not doing the evaluation. You're going through and you'll be answering these questions. This is the final thing.
Perfect. Yeah, that's what I thought.
Answering
Okay.
these kinds of questions in your final project that you're going to put together, because it
Yeah,
basically,
and it's going to be practical. Yeah, and useful in real life, because that's really happening right now. We're
good.
developing it. So
Fantastic.
thank you.
Awesome. All right. Any other questions that we have? And you don't have to have them right now. I just wanted to give you the chance if you have them. All right. Okay, so that's over the next coming weeks. There's not a ton that we're leading into. I give you a little bit of space because most of this stuff we're going to do some stuff in the midterm. So just making sure that you have some kind of know what you're going on. But then we start picking up on some of the assignments as you get into the second half. So just be aware that those do kind of come as we're going along. Just to be aware of that. And for some reason they're not attached in the modules. Oh well, I'll fix that. I'm not very good at Canvas every once in a while. So module 3, this is where we are, given meaning to scores. So today is a little bit of a psychometrics course. So I'm going to stop sharing and share again, but down here. Let me see, down here. So that way when I'm looking at this, you're actually seeing me. I'm going to put that up there. All right, is everyone doing okay? Everyone happy, healthy, good? Nothing crazy going on? Not up in the mountains getting burned? And I mean, like, that's kind of crazy. Is a year, it's just a lot of going on up there. Smoke. Okay. All right. So, oh, that's not what I wanted. All right, well, I guess I'm gonna have to flip it the other way. Swap displays. Yeah, that's what I want. Okay. You got, I am 56, so that means I'm old. So technology is a little slow to me, right? You know what I mean? You can't make fun of my dad anymore because these things are not, I'm not as quick as you guys. I'm figuring it out. Okay, so today we're going to talk about scores, and I'm going to make sure that you guys have an understanding of what we're doing. The reason we focus on this is, again, it's not simply just content so that way you can be bored about it and just kind of know. It really is for you to be able to understand what it is that we're dealing with when we have some of these scores, the tests we use. And the reason for it is if you're going to be doing some type of evaluation, something in a classroom, developing a test, you're evaluating a test that you're using, these are the types of things you should be looking at to better understand, first and foremost, how the actual assessments are used, and then also, is it appropriate for what you're trying to do with it? So we're going to talk about a couple of things that we need to look at that will evaluate it. So as we go through, I'll give you some thoughts, some ideas, and then I would love for you to kind of share some of the things that you kind of what you see. So to start it off, whenever we start to look at scores or assessments, the kind of scores that we're using for whatever it is. Now, when I say assessments, remember, I'm not simply saying assessments like the multiple choice things you may have taken to be able to get through our STAR or other things that you've taken in the past. These can be any type of way, that anything that we're using to assess your ability or competence, whatever it may be. So when you think about it, you kind of have to keep in mind, what are these things? What is this measure that I'm using, this instrument that I'm going to use to give information that I need back for me? So there's a couple things we look at. First one is this idea of a temporal dimension. And what that means is, as you're looking at it, where am I, what do I need to know? Do I want to know your current state, what's happening at this moment? Or do I want to know something that's a future state where I'm going to be where? So when you think about this, a current state is, what is your kind of IQ? That is telling me what is it at this moment? What is your performance in ELA for the 3rd grade at the end of the year? It's a summative type assessment we'll talk about. What is it happening now? A future one would be a little more along the lines of, what is your ability? What some type of skill or ability assessment that you may be able to see that's going to tell me more about what's happening in the future. So when you look at these assessments, you have to decide how are you going to use them. Now, I know that sounds wacky even for me to say this, but I want you to think about the fact that we give an assessment, which is our Smarter Balanced one, at the state level to our students, and we use one assessment for multiple things, which is not a very effective way to be able to use it. It's a large scale assessment that's designed really to give performance of a large group of folks, the state a district, maybe a school, maybe even less so a classroom. We use it on all those things, but it's the performance now. But it's also been, we also do a lot of do a lot of work to make it pushed into the classroom. That's going to be used as some type of predictive thing. How are you going to do in the future? What should you be looking at? And it may not be as appropriate for that. So as we start to think about these, this really does happen in the worlds we're living in. So we have to be kind of, there are better ways to get the information we need if we're looking for something that's in the future as opposed to the current. Make sense? Just a concept that we have. Another aspect of what we're looking at also is this idea of their ability. There's a can do and there's a normally do. Can do is this maximum performance, normally do, this is typical performance. So just kind of thinking about how we actually measure some of this work that a student may actually be able to do in the classroom. Now, remember, maximum performance, you have to make sure that all of the elements of what you're measuring are controlled for, so that way they actually can do that maximally, whether they do or not, that's kind of theirs. And then the last thing that we're going to do, we're going to spend time on this, is this idea of the standard of comparison. This is really important, and this is one of those elements that dynamics kind of characteristics of a test that you need to know as you go through and begin to look at assessments. So with a basic student that you have, you're going to have a whole bunch of stuff. So with this student, you're going to have summative, informative. You may be looking at achievement or adaptive tests, which we'll talk about later on. And then you also are going to be looking at some of this idea of criterion or norm referenced, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Okay, so let's start with criterion and norm reference testing. Not the most exciting topic to think about, but it is really helpful for us to understand how the assessment was created, because it tells me how I can use it and how useful it is in what we're comparing to. So when you think about this term here, and I have it, I kind of got my thing here, criterion referenced, what that means is that the score you're getting at is referenced to a criterion. Okay, keep that in mind. So if I get a score, it's referenced to a criterion. A norm reference test is the score I get is being referenced to something we call a norm. We'll talk about that. It's not norms that you have in your PLCs. It's not norms at your school site. It's different than that. It's a mathematical kind of assessment that we're going to use. So we'll talk about that. But those are very important because the tests are developed in that way, you will end up having different uses for that kind of stuff. Okay, so it will help us kind of make a better decision. So I like history, can't help it. Criterion referenced, Glasser did it in 63. It was really based, what we see more and more with this criterion reference test are these things that came from the standards movement. And the reason being is we began to see that if you set a standard of how we want students to perform, we want to compare how they did to what the standard would be. A norm reference test is really, that was done all the way back in the early 1900s. Your textbook author, they did all that. It's very, very, his grandfather started a lot of this kind of stuff. And a norm really is comparing you to a group of people. Hopefully said group of people is like you. So the group of people perform, we're going to look at it in a second, and your score is compared to how they scored. And we expect you to perform at some level in comparison to that normative group. Criterion is not. A criterion reference test is comparing you to a criterion. In this case, what we see a lot are the standards that we're actually seeing. So let's look at criterion reference testing just for a second. We do it all the time. We're already doing it with Smarter Balanced. It compares that student performance to a predefined set of learning standards or criteria. So if you remember, who was around? Anyone was around when we were going through the whole standards, the switch from the old standards, 97 standards to the Common Core? Remember that? Yeah? Okay. So we went through standards. They developed them. It was a fight. It was a battle. We called them the California They were the California Common Core standards or whatever it was, because it was not necessarily just the US, but it was California. What we found is most important. And when you set those standards, they had to be able to find assessments that are going to give me information about how well a student performs on those assessments. So they went through a huge amount of work to ensure that the assessments they were giving were aligned to what we expect a student to be able to know and understand based upon the instruction that we provide them, which is based upon those standards. And so there's a whole backwards mapping, which we don't need to talk about now. I can just throw you all that. You'd fall asleep. It's boring. I think it's interesting, but nonetheless, it's a little bit whatever. So what they do is you're looking at how well does a student master content. Now, I want you to think about it for a second, okay? So just, and you're welcome to turn your mics on when you answer this. I want to ask you, okay? Let's pretend that let's pretend for a second that we're going to measure mastery of a section in algebra. Hard or easy for us to be able to identify what a student needs to know and understand to be able to master a section, one unit of algebra? Hard or easy? What do you think?
Easy.
Okay, easy is a relative term, but easier, okay? What are some of the challenges with trying to get us to say we want to master an element of English in the 9th grade? How do you measure mastery of something like English in the 9th grade? Or let's do it easier, English in the 8th grade. What are some challenges that may come up?
The way that math is taught in junior high compared to high school.
Okay, so with math, yes, there would difference in instruction, but if let's pull on ELA for a second. What are the dynamics of ELA? At what point can you say a student has mastered something to be able to give them an assessment that they can show that they can perform at mastery level in 8th grade? How does that happen? What do we need to do? What do we need to know? What are some challenges that would come if you were looking at ELA? Anybody have thoughts?
Maybe grammar.
Go ahead, say it again.
Grammar.
Okay, so grammar might be there. That may be something that we would expect that they've had in elementary, but by 8th grade, they should have it mastered. That's true. What else? What are some other things?
Not comprehending.
Okay, comprehension is another one. That's true.
Writing.
What's that? Who said writing? Did you say writing? Yeah, writing's hard.
Yeah, I said writing.
Punctuation.
Absolutely. So what I'm saying is you're starting to look at these elements. What is mastery? Well, they defined it by the standards. And the way they define these standards, guys, you guys know how they do this, right? They bring a whole bunch of people who are teachers like you up to Sacramento, and they sit for like weeks at a time. And they say, is this one that we should focus on? Yeah, this is a good one. Is this a good one? No, that's not a good one. How should we define that one? No, we should define it that way. And it's a process of developing these things with people who are very smart, like you. That's a validity measure that they go through to be able to do that. Then they go out and then they start writing items that measure what you've said is relevant to be taught during that time. And then you know how they begin to ask people, is this relevant? Does it match? Is it correct? Does it measure it at the rigor that we would expect it to be able to do it at? It is a process that they go through real people with real tests and real student results to be able to develop, kind of massage these items to get to the point where they're actually correct. That criterion that we set, what is mastery? What is the level that we usually think mastery is? What percentage between 0 and 100? What do we usually think? Okay, we can live with that to say it's somewhat mastery. What is a number that you guys think? What have you heard?
80%.
80%. Why? Why? Why is it 80%? Why is it? Let me ask you this, and I'm not going to go on a side quest, but why is it that 90% is an A, 80% is a B, 70% is a C, and 60% is a D? Why? I want you to think about an assessment. Why is it that 90% is an A and on down? Why is that?
I feel like if a student gets a 90%, that kind of means they know everything that they're supposed to know. If they get a B, then they know most of what they're supposed to know. And then so on and so forth.
What happens if you have a kid who gets half of it right? So if they get half of it right, they still get an F? If they get 40% of a test, they get an F. 50% of a test, they get an F. 59% of a test, they get an F. Again, I'm not saying to you that it's wrong. What I'm saying to you is we have accepted it as the norm in what we do in education. There is not a third tablet in which God wrote on it and said 90% is an A, 80% is a B, and gave that to Moses. Okay, that did not come, there's no revealed wisdom. There's nothing in textbook. It's just the way we have done it. And anyone who's written a test in this class, anyone who's ever done it, you wrote your test with the assumption that 90% is an A, 80% is a B. You would expect students to get about 80% of the content to be able to show that they're at the level of a B. That doesn't mean that they have to get that. You can make 50%. If they get, you could make a test so hard that we would expect that only they would get about 50% of it. And that is showing that they actually got it right. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, the old STAR tests before back in the old No Child Left Behind days were written that way. We expected most of the students to get at the 50th percentile. And so just keep that in mind as you start to think, where is that breaking point? What is that cut score, as they call it? And where does that fit? With a criterion reference test, you're taking what they know and you're having them take an assessment, whatever it may be, and they compare it to some criterion. So here's an example. I think this is great. I stole this from someone, Renaissance, from somewhere a while ago, but I think this is very useful for us to be able to see. So if you have a cut score that's really high and you have this person that's in there, you're being compared to where the cut score is. It doesn't necessarily mean where they are in the group. All it matters is where they fall according to that cut score. The group can be, we would expect that with a criterion reference test, if kids are doing everything that we want them to do, they'll score high enough that everybody will be above the criteria, the cut score. Does that make sense? So we would expect that. Now that's not realistic and it doesn't happen that way. The best example, did I put it in here? No. Okay. So the best example of a criterion reference test is your driver's license test. It's a criterion reference test. You have to know a certain amount about driving to be able to pass the driver's license test. I don't drive. I didn't get my license because of how you scored on your test. It's how well you scored on your test to get you your license. And it's also a performance task as well, because not only do you have to know about driving, you have to be able to drive. You have to have a certain criteria. Who failed their driving test the first time? Anybody? Come on, come on. I did. Middle of an intersection, light turned red. You're supposed to turn left, crank that sucker in reverse and backed up. So yeah, it happens. But that is a criterion reference test. And it's a really easy example for us to think about, because there are certain criteria, certain things you have to do. Back in my day, you had to make three-point turn. You had to be able to line up with a curb. You had to parallel park. Those are criterion you have to meet in order to qualify for a license. That's a criterion reference test. SBAC is a classic example of that. They've set specific score levels. We'll talk about those in a little bit, but they've got this idea of these scores that you have on here. They are where you say a level 4, a level 3, a level 2, and a level 1. Those are cut scores, and they are based upon scale score ranges, and scale scores are not raw scores. Scale scores are a conversion from a raw score through this magical mystery calculation to give you these scale scores that bring them close together. Don't worry, we're not going to get into that. But basically what you're doing is these are experts like you guys who were sat down and they were asked at how much does a student need to do on the test? How well do they need to do for us to be able to say that they've exceeded the standard? How well do they have to do on the test to say that they've met the standard? That's a criterion reference test. So they've cut those things along, and realistically, you can have everybody score standard met. There is the realistic possibility with a criterion reference test. It doesn't happen, but you could have that. Okay. So criterion reference test, it's a certain type of test, a certain type of assessment. And there are good things you can do with it, but there are some things that are not great about it either. So let's talk about another type. Norm referenced. You may have heard of this before. It is simply comparing one score to a normative group. It measures, the best is that line right there, measures relative performance. It puts you in line with everybody else who took that test and says, where do you fall in line? Okay. So it's basically saying what you do is you develop an assessment, and then you go out and give it to a certain number of people, and their scores are distributed, which we'll look at. And I keep doing this. That's a normal curve. Hopefully it is normal, but whatever. It's a curve that they have in a norm reference test, should have some normality to the curve, meaning that there are some people who score pretty low, some people who score pretty high, more people score in the middle, just kind of in the middle of that. And we would expect that you will fall somewhere within that curve, okay? This is great. The classic one, the SAT and the ACT are norm reference tests. The GRE, the DAT for dentists, the MCAT for doctors, all those are norm reference tests. They give them to a bunch of people, and then they compare you to that norm. The LSAT, which is the law school one, is the norm group is redone every single year. They do it with real data from that year. And then they compare you to how you did to everybody in that year, and then you fall, and that's where your scores are, and that's how they kind of base it. It's a lot of work. IQ tests are done that as well, done in the same way. Okay, so that's this. I like this example again. Norm referenced. A norm reference simply says there's no cut score in there. It's simply where do you fall in this idea of how people are performing. Now, here's the problem. Here's the biggest problem with norm reference tests, and why you need to be aware of this is you're talking about assessments. The most important part of a norm reference test is the normative group. And I think I said this last time, but when they did back in the old days, before they had the STAR test, there was something called the SAT-9, the Stanford 9 test. And the group they used as a normative group, the one they put in there to be able to say, this is how we would expect people to perform, were students from like Iowa. And they were comparing students from Iowa to my students in Riverdale or in Mendota, who may not speak English the way that my folks in Riverdale in Iowa speak. So if my normative group is different enough from me on areas that are important on the assessment, like language, the ability to speak the language of the test, that becomes a problem with how you use the results. That's one way we want you to be able to evaluate the assessments you're using. A norm reference test is great if the norm group actually matches the group that you're comparing to. If it doesn't, that's problematic. So you need to know that. You need to be able to look at these assessments and say, is it a norm group? Does it matter? Is it going to be something that is, or is the norm group large enough? You know, maybe the norm group is for like some of these bigger tests, like we said, some of the intelligence tests are so big now, the norm group is the entire United States. So it's comparative. But if you're outside the United States, it may not work as well. So just keeping these in mind, a norm reference test it can be very, very useful. But again, you wouldn't want a norm reference test for a driver's license exam, because there's always going to be someone who scores at the bottom. There's always going to be, on a norm reference test, there's always going to be someone who's not going to pass. Because if everybody does well, if you're really smart, but you get in a group of really smart people for that norm group, and that norm moves up, if you're not as smart as the group around you, you're going to be at the end down here and you're not driving. And it has nothing to do with your ability to drive. It has everything to do with how you compare to the rest of the group. That's not what we want with those results. So the outcome of the assessment, how we're going to use it, is not appropriate. We'd want to do something else. That's why I want you to be able to think about that. These assessments we use when we go in and measure our programs, when we're measuring in school and in class, we want to make sure that we know where we are. You think about it this way. If I were to go into a classroom and I were to use a norm reference test, which we do, and there's nothing wrong with that, and I were to take my class and give them a norm reference test every single time, that's the only way I based any of their learning or knowledge on, is how well you're doing on a test as compared to everybody else in my class. That may not be telling me much about what they actually know. It only tells me how they compare to everybody else. So if I need a measure that's going to tell me what does this person know, and instructionally I need to know what they know, because I need to know what they don't know so I can teach it, reteach it, tutor it, address it, whatever. Maybe norm reference test isn't good for me. Maybe that criterion reference test. But that criterion reference test better be testing what it is I find is most important. So there's a lot of conversation about teaching to a test. And the problem we find more than anything else is less about teaching to the test, but more about finding tests for which they're worth teaching to. Because we have enough content in there that it's really measuring what we find is most important. That's why creating these assessments is really challenging. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second. Questions, thoughts, ideas, shout it out. Any thoughts about it?
Yeah, I don't know if you heard about IGCSEs and GCSEs from the British system.
Yes.
Yeah, I've taught the British system for many years, and I've never heard of these two names, criterion, norm, standard test, but I am trying to think about the IGCSE as a norm test. And I remember that it was very, very hard to explain to parents how that worked, because this school, I worked at the British school, and all the students were supposed to take that test, and was part of their contract when they enrolled the kids in there. And but the system was in Brazil, and the system in Brazil is completely different. The system in Brazil is 0 to 10 percentages, and across a certain you compare it to the criteria, you compare it to the standards established by Brazilian Ministry of Education and stuff. So sometimes a kid would take would fall into a D or C, and that would put them in a 6 out of 10. And they didn't understand, where does this come from, blah blah blah. And then it took me a long time to understand the system and try to explain it to the parents, because what they do is that the international version of that is the version what we took. It's exactly like that. Every year they get all the scores, the raw scores, and they rank the kids. And the first percentile, like a 10%, is an A star. And then you start following down. But every year, depending on how hard that test was, this could be like a person that scored 50% of the whole test fell in the grade boundary A star, because everybody scored low. So if everybody scored low, this A star is a person that actually got only 50% of it. Like, so it's hard to make it, but in a way, kind of it corrects some distortions in a way. So it is important, as you said. And I thought that this explanation was pretty clear and very useful, because it doesn't matter if this is fair or not. What matters is what we want with it. So to understand what we are doing it.
It's true. Correct. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Please, Emily, go for it.
So I just had a question and was wondering your opinion about it. So you were talking about like tests and the percentages and like so my school does the standards-based grading. We're on a scale of 1 to 4, and the percentages and meeting the standard, ours is 60% is a 3. So when they get to middle school though and high school, they go back to the original grading. Do you find that like counterproductive, as far as like trying to explain to parents that they're meeting the standards? Yes, it's at 60%, but now they go to junior high and they're getting a 60% and it's a D.
Yeah, it's hard to explain that to the parents. There's nothing wrong with that approach, in the sense of saying 60%. If you truly have your content to be able to say 60% of this material is where it, if you're getting it standard 60%, you're kind of expecting between 60 and 80, where that's where most of our students should be living, because they're really getting it and kind of move on. And if you're really exceeding, you're getting from 80 to 100%, because that's where that's like the kids that are really off the charts. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's however you set up your assessments, however you set up kind of your measures. But yeah, it'll be confusing to parents, because God wrote it in the tablets that it's ABCD is 90, 80, 70, 60. And that's just however we did it in college. And so yeah, it can be challenging, but there's nothing wrong with that. In standards-based grading, I've seen a lot of people do it and do it well. If you're consistent and you're real kind of rigorous in making sure that it's consistent across grades, and not across grades, between grades, but then also within the grade. So each teacher is kind of following that same process. That's one of the problems we have with grading altogether, is it can be very subjective. But if we can really kind of make sure that we have this a good operational definition of what we'd expect student to be able to say they're on standard, that does make a difference. Yeah, so that's interesting. Any other thoughts, questions? Okay, I'm going to show you. So I'm going to just do a couple of norms. This is relevant to any of my folks who are reading teachers. How many of you, if anyone's ever given some of these reading assessments in elementary schools, you'll see that they'll have some of these grade norms, they'll have age norms. So basically saying that a child who's at you're reading at the 4th grade level, you're reading at the 3rd grade level. You guys have probably heard this before. You're reading at the 2nd grade level. That's a grade norm. That means that they've normed a whole bunch of kids who are at this level, and this is how they're reading, and you compare their score to that. Same thing with age. They'll talk about this where they'll say, a student comes in and COVID caused people to lose a whole year's worth of education because they're regressing or they're struggling. So these age norms, this is what we would expect a 10-year-old to be able to do in this particular area. And they compare them to those ages. So that's an age norm. I don't love them. Grade and age norms are a little bit squishy, especially as you get older. What's the difference between a 10th and 11th grader when you talk about this? I mean, between a 15 and a 16-year-old, how they can be compared in English. We get more into the criteria and more into the kind of specifics, content knowledge that you're getting at as well. So that makes it a little bit different. So let's see here. Just a couple other norms. Why is this not working now? All right. There's sometimes we get into percentile norms. There's also these standard scores. We've talked about some of the standard scores. The most classic standard score that we have is IQ. Just so you guys know that. Does anyone know what's the mean score for an IQ? Oh, it's right there. The mean is 100, right? Standard deviation is 15. So if you have an IQ of 130, you're 2 standard deviations above the mean, and that's pretty darn smart. If you're 145, you're 3 standard deviations above the mean, and that's really smart. We use these standard scores, norms on assessments for special education. I don't know if you knew that. They did that for a long time. That's how you qualify for special education. They had to be 1.5 standard deviations below the mean on this measure to be able to qualify them. And there are kids who are not quite there. Maybe they're a point off or a percentage point off, and because of that, they don't qualify. So there's ways that we use these standard scores in education all the time, these kind of norm kind of scores. And then sometimes we do national norms as well, which are larger ones, kind of being able to say, how do you represent across the nation? We do this with a lot of different assessments, as long as the assessments are national. We've done some of those as well. Sometimes you'll do local norms, not as often, but you may do them for your schools or your districts to be able to compare how I actually am doing and comparing with others. Very dynamic, can be very useful for us to be able to address specific context in the district that I'm working in. So if I've got a large English learner population and I want to make sure that how I'm comparing or how they're doing in comparison to their peers that way, it helps me kind of give that information. But again, there are some limitations to that, because if I expect you to be able to perform at a certain level or do something that the state has identified, we want to make sure that that criterion is set and you know where they want to be. So norm reference test, criterion reference test, I think this is a pretty good little chart that I like, that's helpful for us to be able to kind of see what some of those features are. Some of the score reporting, generally, we're going to talk about some of these score stuff in a minute. There's a couple different ways. Again, use case with norm reference is usually ranking, put people into ranks. Criterion is really getting at mastery. We expect you to be at a certain level. So everybody could be at that level. Norm reference, you can't all be at that level. They're always going to have someone who's going to be at the end of the line, always, just the way it is. So, and then kind of looking at some of these advantages and the limitations. Okay, so sometimes we don't really care how you compare to your peers, but sometimes you do. So criterion is not really kind of what you want. It depends. We do like criterion reference. We do like the norm reference test for us to be able to get into school. Because if all we did was measured mastery, then there'd be so many people who'd get in. And so with a norm reference test, it gives us a top percentage that we can actually limit the numbers that actually get into school. Whether that's right or wrong, or whether you agree with that or disagree with that, that's That's what the world has done with some of these assessments. Norm referenced, criterion referenced along those lines. And we've talked about that, so we don't need to go into there. As we think about how you set up your systems in your schools, I want you to know that I am not bashing norm referenced or a criterion referenced test. As you look at it, there's a variety of ways. We should have what we call a balanced assessment system. And this is well beyond our scope for tonight and could take another 5 or 6 classes, which we're not going to do. But a balanced assessment system really does give me a balance of tools that I can use to measure what a child knows and understands in a school site. So as you're setting up the curriculum or the work that's being done in your grade level, if you guys go in, because there's a lot of curriculum and instruction folks in here, if you go in and you're tasked at the district level to be able to put together an assessment system in a district, we want to look, there should be some type of criterion reference test to be able to give us a little better information about what we're going to do from day to day. If all I have is norm referenced, that doesn't tell me where my kids are falling short, where there needs to be reinstruction, review, tutoring. It just doesn't give it that way. Whereas a norm reference test is nice because it does help us at the district level, maybe as a superintendent or assistant superintendent, to be able to look at how are all of my students doing in this idea of English language arts as compared to the state of California. Should we be doing more? Should I be allocating more resources here? Should I be doing more instruction? Should I be bringing more tutors for the math because they're just not getting? So it depends. We want a nice balance. So when we look at these, and this balance is not simply for this is just one factor, but there's a lot of other pieces that you would include in the balance. And that could be some of the summative assessments or the formative assessments that you use. How is instructional decision-making made? How is decision-making as a whole made? How are you communicating performance to the student, and how are you communicating that to the parent? And what do they know and what do they understand about what you're trying to do to them? So as you're building these systems, these are components that we need to think about. How do we use these scores to build an assessment system that gives the information as a whole to a school, to a student, to a teacher, and as a district? There are ones that we spend a lot of time with that don't really resonate in a classroom as much. And I say that with some of the smarter balance and some of the large scale assessments we use at the state level. So it depends upon how you're going to use them. And it's important for us to know what those assessments are so that way we use them correctly when we get into that idea. Okay, questions, thoughts, other things along those lines. We're going to talk about other kinds of scores at the end here before we for the rest of the night. Before we move on, anything before I get to this stuff? Thoughts, comments, questions?
I would just like to comment very quickly on something that is just curious. Maybe it's not on the scope of this, but it's just curious and just popped up in my mind because in what happened in the COVID, during COVID, is something interesting because everybody's performance in a way dropped. So there was a huge drop in performance, like in general. And I felt a lot of teachers like sharing the same frustration of having their kids not performing, and yet you were still doing the same thing, but you had a class. If you were a teacher from, I don't know, teaching 5th grade for 5-6 years, and you taught before COVID, and then you kept on teaching those same levels later, you teach the same way. You back in school, and after COVID you were doing the same thing, but yet the kids are, and so and this was something that created a lot of, at least in my environment, created a lot of issues and concerns, because what are we doing wrong? And the grades are coming down. And then at a certain moment, I think that there was this lack of understanding at some points that if we are in a criterion type of criterion norm, and we are evaluating the kids, what they can do against a certain criteria that was designed. If a kid, for example, I taught geography class, grade 6, which is like about 11 years old. And I clearly noticed that after COVID, so when I was teaching map skills, for example, we expected them to know how to use a ruler. before. And then at that point, we were teaching plans and maps, and I noticed that they all scored very low, even the smarter kids, because they lacked 2 years of school and they lacked that previous knowledge. And now I am just assessing them against the criteria designed before COVID. So before COVID, we designed that was the expectation. But now my fifth grades are not able, for anyway reasons, to us to reach that criteria, and we did not do anything at that moment. So I don't know how things are at the moment, because I'm away from the classroom for the last 2 years. But I thought it was interesting that it took a little long for us to notice that, and I was just curious how this was in the region and in this area here.
We have very similar issues. You're reinforcing a fact that I've probably said 1,000 times in my professional career, and that is the idea that context matters. So if we set a criterion for mastery, we want you to be able to do X, whatever that may be. And I have spent these kids have spent so many years, or I've spent so many years teaching in a certain context, in a classroom, sitting at a desk, in a group of kids, doing this and that and the other. And I suddenly change the context. And we know this, you guys, remember this. I can tell you the date. It was March 14th, 2020. I remember when our school districts, when our county office shut down and they sent everybody home, and everybody was sent back into the house to all of a sudden do instruction via Zoom. And we didn't instruct that way. The way we instruct, the instructional process matters. The context under which students are learning, it makes a difference on their retention, their knowledge, their understanding, and the rest. The distractions in a classroom, the distractions in a home are different than they are when you're in a classroom setting. And so kids did not adapt very well. We didn't adapt very well to the way we instructed. Context matters, and therefore we had scores that were going down. Now, had we stayed in a virtual environment for 5 years total and kept every kid at home, what do you think would have happened with scores, test scores per se? What do you think would have happened? What do you think? Down, up? What do you think?
I think it would go back up. Yes.
There's a great study that was done in the 80s by Dean Koretz, and he found that in, I think it was Colorado, they were giving a certain type of test for years, and the scores on this test were going up, and they got pretty high. And then one year, the legislature or whoever, Department of Education, said we need to change this test, and they changed the test they were giving to a different test. It was completely different modality, totally different thing. What do you imagine happened to the scores? Just dropped. Everybody freaked out. Well, they gave this new test for a few years, and the scores started to rise. Well, mean researchers said, hey, let's see what happens if we give them the old test and see if they remember. They gave the kids the old test. Their scores were significantly lower than they had been on the other, because context under which we assess and teach and instruct matters. So when you change it, it changes their ability to retain, learn, and whatever, and therefore they're not going to get at that, especially when you have a criterion reference test. Now, in a norm reference test, if everybody's in the situation, which everyone was, kids probably didn't shift in line. They probably stayed the same where they were in line. If you were 70th in line, you probably were within 1 or 2 or 3. I mean, there could have been some additional resources at home, but by and large, you stayed where you placed in line. But that level of mastery, kids struggled. And we use criterion reference tests for our standardized assessments in California. Therefore, our kids dropped. It totally makes sense. And so that's because the context under which we're assessing matters when we're trying to get to mastery. And that's why it's good for us to know these things. Even though it seems like minutia, it's really important for us to be able to have the context to understand what it is that we're doing as we change some of those. I mean, holy cow, I walked past my son during COVID, and he was in 9th grade, and I walked past and he's sitting at the desk, and he has his iPad here, and he has the computer here, and he has the screen, which I'm looking on here. And on the screen, on his iPad, he has the slides from the teacher. On his laptop, he has the Zoom, and on the giant screen in front of him, he was on with all of his friends playing Halo, and like with the controller in his lap playing Halo while the teacher's lecturing. I mean, come on, what's he learning in there? You know what I mean? And here I am, you know, I was literally leaving for a meeting to go be, you know, the educational expert in assessment for the state of California, talking about, and my friggin' kid's sitting there playing Halo in the middle of, you know, and he was living his best life. This was the greatest thing he ever could do. You know what I mean? He had 10 of his friends and they're playing games, having a great time. The context under which they're learning, though, it drastically changed. It just wasn't great. And so there are some kids who can do that. There were a lot of kids who couldn't. And that's why we saw some of these, you know, a lot of regression. Anyway, I can go on to talk more about those things. So, all right. Any other thoughts, comments, please? I want to open up if there's questions or thoughts, questions you have. Okay, we're going to talk about scores for a second. It's good for us to talk a little bit about numbers and what these, when you see them in the assessments that you may see or develop, kind of what do these scores mean? What does it mean when I see these? And you may have heard some of these words and you may not, but you will as you go along. So the first thing, just so you're aware, there's something that we call standard scores. Now that's a very broad term, but a standard score is when you take a raw score, and a raw score means if I have a test that has 27 items on it, a raw score is how many questions I got right out of 27. Now you could weight tests. So this item is worth a half a point, and this item is worth 1 point. That's a different raw score. You see what I mean? There's a whole combination you can do that, but that's a raw score. I got 24 out of 27 items correct. That's great, but that doesn't help me understand where a student often falls and how he compares to others and how close she is to this. So what we tend to do is we tend to take those scores and convert them in a variety of ways. And you'll see them in multitudes of ways across tests. Scale scores for the Smarter Balanced assessments are a standard score. They've taken it and they've kind of monkeyed around with it in the background to kind of put it on a scale that ranges from, I think it's 400, 500, all the way up to, I can't remember how, it's 1400, 1800, something like that. And the reason they did that is back in the old days, one of the biggest complaints about the STAR test in the early 2000s was there was no relationship between 4th grade scores and 5th grade scores. So if I scored I don't know, 67 in 5th grade or 4th grade, if I scored 67 in 5th grade, does that mean I did better? Not necessarily. They didn't, when they designed the assessments, they weren't done that way. So they pushed really hard with Smarter Balance with these scale scores. You'll notice that if you look at it actually in the area, there is a presumption that for each year, your score will go up as you take these assessments in ELA or math or science as well. That's the expectation as you do this. And so they've developed the scale that it moves up as you go along. That's a standard score they've taken and turned it into something. How they do it and why they do it that way and what the weighting gets like is really hard to do. You can't look at it and say because they got this number of items. And there's another reason for that as well, which we'll get to in a few minutes here. So there's just a couple types of scores that we're going to talk about really quickly. Z-scores, normal curve equivalents, Stanines, things along those lines. Everybody in this room right now has used a standard score. And the standard score you've used is this one. It's a percentile. Everybody's done it because we just got done talking about it. How did you do on the test? You got an 80%. Well, often even grades are not really 80%. It's a certain number of correct points and this and that, and then we put it into this false little thing that we call a percentile. If you look into my syllabus, I have created percentiles based upon the raw scores of points you earn in this class. Everybody's done it. So a percentile is simply taking a raw score and turning it into something that we all know and understand. If I said you got 27 on the test, you'd be like, I don't even know what that means. But if I say you got a 90% on the test, you'd go, oh, I get it. So that's what this does. It allows us to take a raw score that may not be comparable or understandable across it and turn it into something that people will understand. By and large, what it's done is it puts you into this kind of line, puts you into a line. The 84th percentile means that you're like 84th in line. Like out of 100 people who took the test, you're about 84th in line. And so that's what it does. Very useful, Parents understand it, kids get it really quickly, so we use it all the time in education. One that is not as easily understandable, but of course you know all about it because of your successful completion of statistics, and you remember everything you learned in statistics, so I should be able to just show you this slide and you just be able to repeat everything and know exactly what it is, but is a z-score. Z-score is simply, it's a conversion as well, but all you do is you take a raw score and you turn it into a standard deviation unit. You tell that z-score, if I get a z-score of 1.65, that means that I am 1.65 standard deviations above the average for whatever I'm measuring there. Sometimes it's the whole population, sometimes it's just the group that I'm being compared to, but it tells me how I performed in comparison to everybody else. So it's in a normal distribution. It's very helpful because typically when you get 2 standard deviations above anything, you get into the kind of oh crap zone or the wow zone, or you get into where the critical area that you're saying they've done really well or really below. And so it's really helpful for us to know and understand that, to use it. If I were to have 2 different tests, one was done on a 49-point scale and the other one was done on an 85-point scale, and I got 38 on one and 62 on the other, which one did I do better on? You're kind of like, I'm not really sure. If I turn them into z-scores, now I can compare them. That's what you do. You convert those scores into something that I can compare side to side to, and it's very useful to be able to see your performance in there and how far you are above it. Okay. So z-scores, if you remember, I'm not going to make you calculate z-scores. I just want you to see z-scores are used. That we didn't just have you do it in statistics because we think it's interesting to watch you suffer and sweat. We actually did it because they are a useful tool for us to think about how we compare this work in testing and the rest. Normal curve equivalents are a little more nuanced. They're a little harder to understand along those lines, but they're looking at equal interval scales. They're like a percentile. They're done like this percentile, but they're a little bit of a different idea. So you're gonna if you have some that has a mean and a standard deviation, you're going to be able to look to see how they average and look across. It's a little more complex. I'm not going to spend too much time here. I just want you to know this is another way we use test scores. That you'll see scores with normal curve equivalents. A stay9 is a standard 9. You've broken your percentiles up into nine equal groups between, and if you get a stay9 of a certain number, then 9 means you're in the highest one, 1 means you're in the lowest one. That's all it is. Sometimes they like that level of distance, and I'll show you that. This is the best way to see this. So this is your classic example. All of us have seen these before. That bell-shaped curve across the top, that is exactly what we did in statistics. If you look back in here, 34% of the scores fall between a 0 and 1 standard deviation below, 34.13 from here. And this is called a density curve, if you remember it from statistics. This is what our z-scores are on. This is what you're based on, if you remember that. If you go along here, these are standard deviation units. These are cumulative percentages of scores that fall. So 99% of scores-ish fall about 3 within 3 standard deviations above. All that is down below. You also have now percentiles and how they fall. Remember, a percentile is the percentage of scores that are there. So when you're looking at it, what is the 99th percentile? It's about right here. Here are my z-scores. T-scores are, oops, I didn't mean to do that. T-scores are another measure. Don't worry about it. Here's my stay9s and the percentage of scores that fall within the stay9s. You don't need to memorize this. I'm not going to ask you to reproduce this on an assessment. What I want you to be familiar with is if you're looking through a test and they're reporting scores in T-scores, which they do, you can look at it and go, okay, I understand what that means. A T-score is simply 50. A T-score of 50 is the middle of the distribution. That's like a 0 on a standard deviation or a 0 on a z-score. It's right there in the middle. And they do that because it allows them to give a little more of they don't like negative numbers at times. So T-scores get rid of these negatives, which are down here, which they don't love. So with a T-score, it's just taken the scale, massaged it in a new way to kind of put it across there so that way you don't have negative numbers. Don't over stress about it. but you may see this. They do report T-scores on assessments sometimes. They'll put percentiles, they'll put Z-scores. All those things are in there when we're looking at the assessments. See them all the time. Has anyone seen any of those scores in any of the assessments you've ever given to your kids? I don't know if anyone has. Maybe you close your eyes and flip the page if it comes up when you see them, because you're like, I don't want to see that. I don't want to see that. Anyone ever seen a T-score? If you were a psychologist, you would. Psychologists learn all this stuff because they have to know about it. Okay, let's talk about one more thing that I think most people usually find is kind of interesting, is this idea of computer adaptive testing. And we're going to talk about AI later in another unit, but we need to talk a little bit about a computer adaptive testing and how it has changed the way some of the assessments are done now. And we're getting more and more computer adaptive tests that are done. We do have them. Smarter Balance is computer adaptive. And it's a pretty novel and interesting way for us to get at what a child knows and understands on the assessments, okay? So a computer adaptive test does exactly what you would expect it to do. It's intelligent, it's using some features of AI, and basically what it does, and I'm gonna move this here because I think this is a good way to, I like this graphic, I stole it from somewhere, I don't know where I got it, but what it does is it gives you an item first. And the item that it gives you is kind of that initial, usually middle of the road difficulty level. Okay, so it's like a middle difficulty item. Each item, I'm going to pause for a second and step back. Every item that is created on any assessment has a level of difficulty. And difficulty is different than this idea of rigor. Difficulty really just says, how hard is it? How hard is the actual item to get right? And each one, whenever they develop an assessment in professional world, when you're developing assessments, there is a level of difficulty assigned to each one of the items. So in this one here, you're getting a middle of the road difficult item. You answer it. If you get it right, the next question you get is going to be harder. It's going to move it up. If you get it wrong, it drops it down a little bit. And what computer adaptive testing does is it adapts the difficulty of the items because it's trying to get you right at the old Vygotsky zone of proximal development, you know, that thing where it's just about that area where it's right about the sweet spot of difficulty for you where you're going to get it. And so that's what it's doing. It's kind of measuring it, calibrating the items that you get till you get to the point where it's right about in the middle of where you should say this is really where they are at. Now, what I want you to notice on this one, and this is really important, I want you to see that if you look at the top row, if each dot represents an item on an assessment, this guy here needed more items to get to his number. She needed fewer items to get to her number. Computer adaptive tests do not test with the same number of items. They look at consistency. When you start getting in an area where they're done, then they stop and that's where your score is. And on the Smarter Balanced assessment, that is absolutely the case. You will have kids that will have longer tests than other kids because the computer is struggling to figure out where that student is, and so they end up with more items. The more variability that happens between your score, if you get it right, and then you get a harder one, and that one you get right again, but then you get a little easier one, and it goes really, you get it wrong. All that kind of stuff, the error that's in there makes it harder for it to find where you actually are. But that's what a computer adaptive test does. And then once it gets to that area of where you are, where it feels that it's measured it, it stops and you don't take any more assessments. So that's kind of where that kind of gives you this idea. It's better on precision. One of the things we like that we need in assessments is that you have to generalize with our old assessments across all types of learners. So I have to give longer tests because I might have some struggles with some kids who actually I'm not really getting the content of what I need. Whereas this one here, it can be a little shorter, it can be a little more precise, a little better. The challenge with this, I was going to say the problem is not the word. The challenge is you got to have really good items that it really is as difficult or not as whatever the measure of difficulty it has to be that level. If you've got some bit of error in there, if there's problems with it, or your population that you're measuring does not experience the level of difficulty that maybe the population that you develop the test item on, that may not be as predictive for you, and you have problems with that. And so a computer adapted test does kind of, there can be some hinkiness along those lines as well. They're used all over the place. There's a ton of them. So here's some that are used right now in your schools. The MAP, Smarter Balance, Renaissance Star Assessments uses it for adaptive early literacy and math assessments. Very, very useful. iReady diagnostic tool does that as well. It's computer adapted, and the GRE is also, and the GMAT. I took the GRE years ago, but this new one, they have adaptive sections as well. And they are designed so that way you can get a little more precise measure of where these students are. They're they're great. So the reason I show this to you as well is, I think I said this even a little bit last time, and I'll reinforce it. There's kind of a push out there in the world at the moment to say, have teachers write their own assessments in the classroom. And I say, why? When you have these that are going to do, you don't have to do it, and they're going to be a little more precise, and they've put the sweat and effort into it. How about you teach, which is what you've learned in school and what you've done, and let them create the assessments, and then you use the results in your teaching process. So when you see this level of sophistication in assessments that we just didn't have 15 years ago, like we couldn't do this kind of stuff. When we were teaching, when we were working with this, you didn't have this level of it. And we do now, and it's available to us, and it's pretty good. It's, again, in a balanced system, this could be one very nice tool that you can be able to use. As you can see right here, you do get really quick feedback. Now, there's some issues as well, because you don't really have, and these are the challenges, is that you've got some technology. There are some disadvantages of equity, which we already talked about. The item pool, you have to have really good item pools. And then some of those things is it's harder to kind of figure out what you need to be able to prepare the student to be able to do. And some of them, you don't get this quick adaptability from your open-ended questions that you're going to get. You just don't get it from written responses. You're still kind of relying on multiple choice, or some type of selection type of item, which again is not a bad thing, but if you don't spend the time to write really good at those selected choice items, they may not be giving you as much information as you need, and as you would get. Remember, open response or constructed response items, they give you different things. A score, like a statistic that's going to come from a closed response or a yes or no, tells me often what, did you get it? But the open one, it gives me a little more the why. And so that the constructive response gives me a little more depth, and it helps the student think about some of those. So there's a nice balance in there as well. But computer adaptive is great. Anybody use computer? Anyone see them? I know if you're using SBAC, you're using them, but anyone seen them in other ones they're using? Yeah, they're pretty useful to use. But computer adaptive testing, that's a different way to be able to get it. You're still going to get some of the same assessments. Most of these computer adaptive ones are going to be more along the lines of the criterion reference, which they're looking at a criterion to measure. So scores it's good for us to know and understand this. It's useful for us to be able to use this as we're evaluating and thinking about the assessments and what types of measures we're using in our work. When we get to the point of an evaluation, you may be developing or designing some of these assessments and thinking about how you would actually use them in the work that you're doing. So that's it for content. I'm open for questions if you have them. If you don't have questions, you don't need to stick around. You can head out. We will be meeting again next week, same time, 7 o'clock. And I hope you guys have a great week. I'm here if you have questions.
I have a question,
Yeah, go ahead.
Professor. So my book hasn't arrived. Is there a way that you can upload the first 2 chapters to Canvas?
That would be a lift, because it's to be able to scan. It's a pretty thick thing. How far out are you? I think you're going to be okay, because a lot of the first 2 chapters are pretty basic, and I'm covering a lot of the stuff that we have in there as well. So I think we'll be okay. If it doesn't go by next week, let me know and I can see what I can do. It's just, to do that is quite a lot of pages, and I'd be standing at the copier scanning for a long time. doing that, but I think you'll be okay, because again, most of the stuff I'm having and what you're tested on, I don't try to trick you on the assessment in the midterm. It's more what we're doing in class, and the book just reinforces what you're doing from there. You see what I'm saying?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I'll see you next week. Thank
Got
you.
it. See you next week. Other questions, throw it out there.
I have a question real quick on, so I'm on the cat with with the SBAC and the level of difficulty for questions. So how does that end up working if, we have the like, so one person can, is it like, how does that work? How is that fair? Do they end up still getting the same questions at the end, or?
Fair, we're not talking fair. Fair is not, that's not the word we're using when we're talking
Yeah.
about assessments. What I
Okay.
want in an assessment is not, I mean, yes, I want fair. I want fair in the sense
Right.
of equity per se. But what I'm more interested in is I want to make sure I can measure what you know and understand. So if I start at the same level, so you and I take a test, and at the beginning of that test, the item may be different, but the difficulty level should be very similar. So it should be enough to be able to say, even though I'm asking you one question about something, the question they ask me is a little bit different about what they're asking, but the difficulty of those is similar. If we score differently on those items, and it branches us off into different areas as we're going through, and we're kind of going to different ways, that's what a test should do. It should be dynamic enough to be able to get at your thinking and how well you know and understand it, to be able to get to where this is the score. This person is unique in what they understand and what they know and how they comprehended it. And therefore, this is how they scored on this assessment. And that's what an assessment should do. It should be dynamic enough to be able to really give me a score about what your performance is, not necessarily the others. I'm sure you've experienced it either as a teacher or as an individual, your own self, where you've taken a test where we call that has a major ceiling effect. What that means is that you had everyone in the class or a whole bunch of kids get 100% on the test. Well, that doesn't help. If I get 100% on the test, that's great. But maybe the kid could have gotten 120, but my items weren't difficult enough to get to that next level. And so therefore, I'm limited in what I can know about that child because my items are not difficult enough. Or it might even be the other direction. Maybe a kid is getting bombing on the test on every single one. And because they're bombing on the test, that doesn't tell me what they don't know. So if I get it low enough, I get scores that will go. And so these computer adapted tests, this is so funny because we used to talk about this all the time with the people that did it. It does actually move into above the standard and below the standard on some of the items, because it wants to prevent that ceiling effect from these kids who are really, really smart. And therefore, you're not getting the range of where they are, and you're not getting the information you're getting from them. So a really good computer adaptive test gives you that. It gives the flexibility to allow a kid to spread, whereas the other ones only getting in the middle. And when I get the middle, I hit the top, and it doesn't, I don't know what they know. And these kids are bored, they don't get it. Whereas the other ones really do challenge them. That's the idea. It's more for the up than for the down. If you understand what I'm saying, it's more for the kind of kids that will exceed that ceiling than those who would be kind of down on the floor. Because the ones that are down on the floor, when you're seeing that, you may be wanting to use different types of assessments, and that's why they have some of the other tests. But yeah, it's not about fair. It's about what's most appropriate for the kid who needs what they need at that time. Make sense?
Yes, I understand what you're saying about it being dynamic and why it needs to be higher, lower, why it needs to be that way. I guess my question would still be for the kids, the equity part. So it doesn't work in the way where a person would get super difficult questions and then not meet because they get super difficult questions versus a kid who got not as difficult questions and they would meet. It wouldn't work that way, right?
It's not going to be that way. It's going to be, but there is going to be an element of this idea that if we're looking for, first of all, coverage of the content. So you should be able to go across I can get real technical, but I'm not going to, but there's the term called a blueprint. If a blueprint is basically the types of items and the number of items that are measuring what we expect to measure across a test. So if I have a unit that's measuring polynomials, I want to make sure I have to measure this part of it, I have to measure this part of it, and I'm gonna have 3 questions that do this for it, whatever. So there should be enough items to cover what we expect them to know and understand across it. number one. So all of them do that. But then what it also does is it just gets the level of difficulty for that child. So if it kind of pushes them in that area, then as you get into there, then it can kind of say, based upon where we see they're getting this, how are they performing? How are they scoring? Are they scoring low? It's not just putting it at making it easy for them and then they're going to get them all right, or making it hard for them, then they're going to get it all wrong. No, it's there, but there is that is a good question to ask, but no, that doesn't do that. It still expects you to be able to know some of these, because some of it is not just what you, it's not just how you perform, but it's really the content and how, what you know and how you apply it. And that's what's better about some of the newer assessments and some of the older ones. I don't know. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Yes, that helps. Thank you.
Other questions?
I was here just like way to talk about a little bit of my late entrance in those, but I was happy to hear this discussion, and it just I just thought about what you're saying in terms of the fairness that she was pointing out. But I think that if we think these adaptive tests as the formative type of assessment, not summative, we're not using that for summative as a summative assessment.
Well, they are.
Or do we?
California uses them as a summative one right now. That's what they use.
Mm.
That's how they use
Okay.
it in Smarter Balance for sure.
Okay. Oh, it's interesting. And
Yes. So you're coming in late because you're trying to graduate.
yes, it was a little bit of I was meant to go in another class, and then I figured out that the advancement to candidacy had I had it already approved with the ERE288. So I only figured out that later, and then I didn't want to mess up with that. And I said, okay, let's just start and let's do it. But I'm very, very happy to be in the class. You actually, I just saw your name in a. I was today at Clovis Global.
Oh yeah.
Academy, and I was filling out some information about that. I wasn't in an interview that, by the way, and with Hermit.
Meet. He's a great guy. He's a great
Yeah,
guy.
it was awesome. The interview was a great conversation actually, and then I was like looking at the information, and I saw your name. I said, I think this is the name of my professor. So it's good that and in the end it was actually. So I was very happy that in the end I am here doing the course. I think that it's for this class. I am usually not. I am usually the person that complains a lot about statistics, but I like to talk about the statistics or study or analyze things in the statistics the way you were pointing out. Like you made it very easy for us to put statistics on all this discussion.
We want to make it useful. That's it. Awesome.
Exactly.
No problem. You have the syllabus. We haven't done much other than a couple of discussion posts. You can go in and finish those. And
yeah, I just did the introduction, but I'm not even the Canva. I was like late on the Canva, and then but I watched the pre-recorded class, and then today I'm kind of getting back and trying to catch up. So I hope by the end of the weekend I can.
About 90% of these are going to be live like this. There will be a few of them. There'll be a couple of them that I just by nature of my job, I will not be able to be here on a Thursday night to record. But by and large, it's going to be just
perfect.
I may be sitting in a hotel room. Often I will be.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Have a great end of your evening. See you next week.
Veronica, did you have a question?
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, Veronica, any thoughts, questions?